evidence is the basic in a debating competition. But on top of that, you should try to challenge and tell the judges your pieces of evidence is more convincing. Yeah, that's something important.
Before we go here, I could be reading any debate book. It doesn't really matter. Quote, in general, counterplans are non-topical. So you don't, and it says, quote, a non-topical counterplan means you could not propose to enact the same policy as if you were your affirmative team. Now, there's a lot of ramifications for that, but a counterplan, you can't just use your affirmative as a negative. Otherwise, no one would ever do any negatives, besides the fact that a counterplan must address the same harms as theirs. It must solve the same problems. If it solves a different problem, it's not a true counterplan. Okay.
Let me just do one more thing too. Is I think again, when you're in the middle of the debate, sometimes it's hard to think about these things. But for example, you had the argument that it's 90% are first offenses, only 10% are first offenses. So you kind of try to minimize the significance of the repeat offenders as they would define it for those that are like 2 or more. But when you said 10%, is that considered low? Well, one case is good enough. My feeling is, I think going to the sense of one person is enough. You don't need to do that. Just do your math. You gave evidence that said in 2013 there were 13,928 cases of sex offenses, reported sex offenses. I assume there were probably even much more. Well, 10% of what 13,000. How much? 1,300, 1,400. That's a significant number. I don't think that's something that you should say, oh, that's just, we can't use that number. So I think trying to think on your feet is one of the things that debate's supposed to try to train. So to listen to the people, try to come up with your arguments, but do the math as well sometimes, especially since a lot of evidence is about math because you're talking about significance. How much is it going to affect? You gave evidence that said, or you had an argument that said, well, their evidence was from 8% to 6%. Well, is only 2% decrease is enough? That was your first argument. Then when they said, well, we think it's enough, it's still a decrease, then you came with the argument, well, but there's just fluctuation. There's general fluctuation. But if you think about that, fluctuation is 25%, 25%, 8%, 2% fluctuation, 25%. Most fluctuation, I don't know, is the sex offense rate from year to year fluctuates? So you think those are the issues. So when you bring up an argument, then the next becomes an issue. So when they said that, you should have rebutted and said, well, they say that this is just natural fluctuation, it's 2%. It's not really because of the notification or whatever. Well, but
he said that with no evidence.
Yeah, but what's the evidence? Where is there evidence that 2% is within this yearly fluctuation that happens with sexual offense? Yes, I agree that fluctuations can happen, but to 2%, or is this significant? Or you could have, if you didn't know that, you could have said, well, our report was in some kind of journal, professional journal or some government report. The government should be smart enough to know that if this is just within the realm of yearly fluctuation, then it's not significant to report. But they reported it, it was approved. So even though they didn't give any negative evidence to show that this was within the fluctuation, our common sense is we should probably trust that this must be outside of the natural fluctuation because it was reported and it was approved by somebody.
But you agreed in the cross-examination. You said, isn't that? Say no. Wouldn't you agree that this is normal fluctuation? No. You don't agree with them? Okay.
Or you could say, well, we think normal fluctuations happen, but not this much, or something like that.
Okay. All right, so are they going to take our ballots then? Debaters, do you have any questions for us? Anything that we said wasn't clear? Yes.
You said that we can only just debate back the plans they have mentioned in their constructive speech, so we cannot perform any counter plans.
No, sure you can, if you follow the rules. We hereby will not defend the status quo. We have a counter plan, and you announce it just like that. And our counter plan is going to be that we're going to launch this corporation that's going to do exactly what you said. Or we're going to have the UN come in and do the following plan for us. But it must be non-topical, and it must solve the same problems. So if theirs is recidivism, yours cannot solve first offenders. This limits the number of counterplans to ones that are more appropriate. Otherwise, everyone would just write their affirmative plan and use it twice, as we saw in one round of the Cicero, where one team was just too lazy to do any negative research. But no, you either defend the status quo, or you launch a counterplan. You can't sort of launch a counterplan. But we wish you would have responded and said, that's not a true counterplan. Or at least said, their arguments are wrong, and they haven't attacked what we said. At least a minimal response to it, even though it's not really a counterplan. Any other questions? Yes.
I have a question on the rebuttal part, which the judge just mentioned. I thought rebuttal shouldn't mention another new opinion or attack, or just...
No, that's not what he said. He said what you should do is summarize the issues you won on, not say new things. You can also, by the way, bring up new evidence. So no new arguments, but it can come up with new
You
evidence.
can't bring up new arguments. Arguments should have been already started or hinted at, within your constructive speech. Rebuttal is to say, well, they presented evidence or they gave other arguments, especially in the second negative constructive, because you haven't had a chance to respond to that yet. You need to respond to those, and then to try to show how you're okay. Your position still is okay, or their evidence has a problem. But what I'm saying is that I think when you started, I just felt like, oh, you were reading, and I'm like, besides the first affirmative constructive, nobody else after that should be reading the speech. But you kind of went through the speech that almost sounded like the first affirmative constructive. The other thing too is I think the second affirmative constructive, now that I mentioned, is you say, okay, let me give you more details of the plan. But I felt like you gave me just a tiny little bit more detail. You really didn't give much more than what the first affirmative constructive said. So if you're really going to give more details of the plan, it really needs to be more details. In my mind, you should at least more than twice as much as what was said in the first affirmative, because you're dedicating your whole speech to maybe presenting the details of the plan. They were having to present the status quo, the harm, and then kind of an outline, general direction of their plan. So you should have spent a lot more detail. So for example, things like, oh, to put the name in, or make clear, you have to put the ID because, you want to, well, this is an interesting thing. I don't know, again, this is, we're talking about potential ways the debate could have gone. But you say you require an ID. I assume you want to say, we want to make sure you're a real citizen of Taiwan in order to check our system, right? You want to know who you are.
If you can,
Well, but what about foreigners? I mean, what about other people who aren't Taiwan citizens? They don't have an ID.
if you're going to follow that style of plan, what I particularly want for a second speaker is, let me tell you how it's going to work. And then it helps us judge, just get a real, an idea that's not just words, in fact, this will happen. This guy offends, so this happens, and this happens. I kind of like that if you're writing the plan style that you guys are using.
And again, make sure the evidence that you're using to support that your plan's going to work has the same thing. So when you kept on using notification evidence to say that notification works and reducing it, well, but you're not doing notification. So that's why I say it's kind of like you weren't clear, exactly what your evidence was saying and what you were going to, does it or doesn't it support your plan. So you have to think carefully.
Okay. Thank you, Robert. And is some person collecting our ballots?
Oh,
Are you going to bring them up? You do want this one.